I finally got to take that trip to Washington that I'd been planning since I was a kid. I had intended to spend most of my time in and around Seattle, but I couldn't pass up the opportunity to go camping in the vast wilderness that is Washington State. I planned on spending just one night in a tent before returning to civilization. This was my first solo camping experience, but I'd camped before with friends. I hired a tent and sleeping bag from a local shop and hiked to a spot where there were campsites. As soon as it was light out, I hopped in my car and headed south. It took me less than 3 hours and was quite simple to get to the campgrounds. The site was just a level field littered with the discarded belongings of prior campers and the remnants of their meals. Where there was some space and a tree, I pitched my tent. Since I wasn't aware of any noteworthy attractions in the area, I was content to simply hang around at sunset. I started a fire and dug out the Ziploc bag of s'mores fixings I'd made in advance. When I was finished, I sat unhealthily close to the fire and pondered my actions. Until I got cut off, that is. A figure materialized out of nowhere and sat across the campfire from me. "Are you saying, 'Oh, you're also camping around here?'" I inquired, hoping to alleviate the strangeness of the situation. He gave me a blank stare when I asked him a question. I turned to check the area behind me and to the sides, but we were alone. After a short pause, he got to his feet and left. I don't know if I was more scared, creeped out, or baffled, but I stayed there for the next hour with my eyes wide open. At some point, I extinguished my fire and retired to my tent where I stayed for another hour until dozing off. A peculiar sound, the crackle of a campfire, woke me up in the middle of the night. When I first opened my eyes, I noticed a flickering orange light outside my tent. As I unzipped the tent, my pulse rate increased and my breathing became shallow. The men had rekindled my campfire, and they were staring at me over the glowing embers. The man who had previously stopped by was among them. I emerged from the tent and stared at them all in shock. One of them muttered something in a foreign language, and before I could respond, 2 of them had jumped to their feet, seized me, and were patting me down and grabbing my phone out of my wallet. There was no point in fighting back against these men, who were easily twice my size. After a thorough search, they forcibly removed me from the encampment. After 20 minutes of walking through the woods, I was on the verge of tears and convinced that this was it when they threw me to the ground, struck me over the head, and ran off. They probably meant to knock me out, or at least knock me senseless so that I wouldn't follow them, but I didn't see any reason to return to them voluntarily under the current conditions. Once the excitement had worn off, my head hurt so much it was hard to think straight, but I got up and began jogging in the direction I believed would get me closer to the interstate that ran between the forest. In addition, it was dark, and I had to navigate my way through the forest while stumbling over fallen logs and tree roots. After approximately half an hour of walking, I blacked out. It was probably a combination of factors, but as I came to it, I discovered I knew much less than before about where to go next. Knowing there was a danger I could get even more disoriented, I walked while praying for the proper way. After a full hour of being surrounded by nothing but towering trees and dense foliage, I observed a flickering light off in the distance, which turned out to be a flashlight carried by an unseen figure. A man turned and shined the light in my direction as I came closer, and then 3 other individuals materialized from behind him as I yelled for aid. I didn't think twice about sprinting away, and they didn't appear to pursue me. Again, that terrified the snot out of me, but I was able to keep moving in the direction they were heading because I could see which way they were headed. At the crack of dawn, after another 2 hours of trudging, I finally made it to the highway. After another half an hour, I signaled for a car and drove back into town, where I called the police. After providing the police with the most accurate account I could, I was able to retrieve my vehicle. Lost rental things were still my responsibility, but fortunately they were the least of my problems. The men who robbed and attacked me didn't appear to be looking to kill anyone, but my prospects of survival in the middle of the night in such a large, dense forest were low. If I hadn't seen them a second time, as terrifying as that experience was, it's unlikely I would still be alive today. I was on the road coming back from an out-of-state job interview. I decided to make a little holiday out of it, so I stayed for a few additional days rather than flying. The rain was soothing in theory, but in practice, it made driving difficult in the middle of the night. The majority of the journey was spent winding along narrow one-lane roads through thick woods. The trip was estimated to take around 10 hours, and I anticipated some delays due to the weather. I looked at my phone at 1:01 a.m. and saw that I had 62 miles until the next turn. Apple Maps was directing me on a different path than I'd gone before, but for some reason, I didn't perceive this as an issue and kept going for a good 20 or 30 minutes before I looked at my phone again. The navigation system still told me I had 62 miles until the next turn. When I zoomed in, I saw that my automobile hadn't moved at all. I attempted to click it and restart the software, but it became stuck on that screen and became even more difficult to use. I had no notion where I was headed or when I needed to turn, apart from a hazy recollection of a street name it had shown me earlier. All it said was to turn right in 62 miles with no road or street name. The circumstance was similar to when you see a street sign and immediately know it, but in this case, I couldn't recall the street name without seeing it. Despite the inconvenience, I continued driving for a while in the hope that it was just a connectivity issue and would go away once I was out of the trees. After what felt like forever, I finally reached the end of the woodland and spotted a street intersection ahead, although in the pouring rain. There was a truck parked nearby, so I assumed they were having the same issue. I came to a stop and took a closer look at the street sign, thinking I could know it. The fact that I turned and gambled anyway suggests that it wasn't a mere coincidence or a faulty memory brought on by sleep deprivation. At first, I was optimistic that I had made the right decision. Nevertheless, an hour later, I was still deep in the woods. Something was off because I was positive that I had not spent this long driving through the woods on the way there. I looked at my phone and got no results, but then I spotted, in the middle of this desolate woodland, the faint illumination of a motel billboard sign. It was a strange motel to choose from, but I parked there nonetheless so I could assess the issue in peace. There was not a single car in sight. However, that identical truck I had seen back at the junction pulled in and parked a few spots down a minute later. I couldn't see them very well in the rain, so I just kept trying to get my phone to work. After what felt like 15 minutes, I went inside the motel to either ask for assistance or check into a room. When I heard a rap on my window, I jumped. The question, "Hey, can you help me?" he shouted amid the pouring rain. I let a little rain in by rolling down the window. When I inquired as to his business, he explained that he was lost and gave me a very particular address, acting as though I was familiar with its whereabouts. "I'm sorry, dude, but I'm as confused as you are." He scowled, then cracked a smile and bid me goodnight. When the timer went off, I jumped out and dashed towards the motel. There was no one working the front desk, and the lobby was dark. The front door opened as I reached over the counter to see whether anyone was in the back. When I turned around, the truck driver outside was still there. His long hair and beard dripped water. His expression was chilly and menacing, and he appeared to have one hand suspiciously jammed inside his pocket. I made a hurried attempt to get around him at that very moment. He stood resolutely in my path, but for some reason I was able to get around him and out the door. I heard the man leave the building, and his footsteps caught up to me as I ran to my car. As the man approached my window, I got inside and started the car. The click of the door latch could be heard through the pouring rain. Thanks be to the auto locks on my car for protecting me from his frighteningly rage-filled eyes as he tried to aggressively open the door as soon as I heard that and looked up at him. The entire vehicle was swaying back and forth from the force of his pulling. I sped out of my parking spot and away from there, nearly running him down. I returned to the crossroads and sped away. Thankfully, after 20 miles, I reached a city and was able to receive assistance. As it turned out, the motel I was staying in had closed down a few months prior, and for some reason, which nobody could explain to me, the sign was still operational. Whether or not that man had premeditated his actions, I will never know, but I do know that I lucked out when I escaped that motel. I lived on my own for the first time in my life when I turned 25. It made me want to explore doing other things by myself too. And one thing I'd always wanted to do was go for a long hike. It might sound a little weird, but it was just something that I thought sounded like an accomplishment to do solo. I had no experience in any outdoor activities, so this was my first big hike online. It said it was 8 hours, so I packed as much water and food as I could, and on Monday morning, I set out on the hike. The first thing I noticed when I started walking was how thin the trail was. I don't know if this was normal or not, but it was barely wide enough to walk on without stepping on the borders of the trail while being thin. But it was still very defined, and I knew I'd be back well before dark, so I wasn't worried about it. Although I didn't do much hiking, I was still in decent shape, so walking long distances wasn't an issue. Most of the way up the trail, I was feeling great and having no problems. But as I kept going, it did start to wear me down a bit. I checked my watch constantly, and once I was 6 hours in and still hadn't reached the end, I was starting to worry. Supposedly, the end of the trail was a small overlook of the valley, so there was no way I could just walk past it or somehow miss it. But according to the website I'd seen earlier, I was 2 hours behind. Then I started to think maybe it meant the trail was 8 hours to complete one way and was not including the walk back, but I just knew that I had to turn back at this point if I wanted to be out of the forest before dark. I turned around and began walking back. The way I came back, as I walked back, I noticed a few things that I hadn't noticed on the way up. Specifically, there was a line of prints that went perpendicular to the path, going right across from one end of the forest to the other, and just kept going as far as I could see. I thought maybe I hadn't seen it before because of the different point of view, but I was already a bit worried, and this wasn't helping my case. Then, 3 hours into the hike back and nearly 9 hours total in the forest, the trail I was walking on started to widen. One thing I knew for sure was that the trail was thin the entire way up, so when I saw this, my stomach tightened. I didn't know how, but I had gotten onto the wrong trail, maybe taking a side path accidentally. I stood there like a terrified child for a few minutes, unsure of my next move. The sun was already setting, and if I had taken the wrong turn in the daytime, how would I make sure to follow my way back and not make the same mistake in the dark? I knew my choices were limited, so I had to turn back and hope for the best. I started walking, but not long into it I saw footprints again, not the same ones from before, and I knew these weren't there just 10 minutes ago. I looked out into the forest in the direction they were going, but it was now too dark to see much. Soon, I couldn't see anything. The moonlight provided a dim overcast, but I hadn't packed the flashlight. It was the middle of April too, so the nights would get pretty cold where I lived. As I walked, the only sound was my footsteps on the gravel and the soft noises the forest made. I heard something ahead, someone else walking on the gravel. I stopped and stared ahead into the dark, but after a few steps, the sound went away. I carefully moved forward until I saw the footprints in the gravel going straight across the trail. I turned my phone's light on and pointed it into the forest. It was still too dim, but I knew someone was out there. "Hello?" I called out. There was nothing but silence. I held my phone light up still, and after a moment I saw a very slight fog from someone's cold breath rise from behind an adjacent tree. They were maybe 10 feet away from me in the forest, but seeing as they were hiding made me scared as to what they were up to and why exactly they didn't want to be seen. I quickly walked further down the trail, and after 30 minutes I found where I had accidentally turned off several hours earlier. I made it out and got to my car. I hated myself for weeks after that for having gotten myself into such a bad situation, but it only got worse. I thought it had been exactly 3 weeks since my hike when I saw on the news that 2 bodies were found in the forest I had hiked in. They didn't give exact locations, but it was in the area near the trail I had taken. I don't think they found out who had done it, but I'm almost positive that at one point I was standing just 10 feet away from them, close enough to see their cold breath in the dark.